Hey guys, welcome back. This is section 5.4 on the historical observations of Mars. Mars can be seen with your eyes, and so people have been looking at Mars as long as there have been people to look up in the sky. But the first recorded observations of Mars come from several millennia ago. The Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Mesopotamians all left records of observing Mars. Some of them were really remarkable. The Egyptians, for example, understood that Mars would occasionally move backwards. This is called retrograde motion. Typically, objects will rise in the east, move across the sky, and then set in the west. The moon does that, the sun does that, the stars do that, planets appear to do that. And Mars does that, but sometimes Mars appears to move in the opposite direction against the background stars. If you want a picture or a figure of what this looks like over the course of several months, you can go to a video I made for section 5.3. Oh, shoot, I'll just show you a picture of it. Right here. You'll notice that Mars is moving east to west, east to west, east to west. This is over weeks and months. And then it will stop over a period of several days and start moving backwards. This part where it stops and moves backwards is called retrograde motion. And the Egyptians understood that Mars was doing this. Probably a lot of other people did too, but the Egyptians were the first to write about it. Or at least the surviving records we have now make the Egyptians first. Babylonian astronomers understood that Mars would basically go around the sun. This isn't quite right, but effectively go around the sun 42 times every 79 years. Think about that for a moment. People who had really nothing to keep time with, I don't think there were even hourglasses in those days. People who had a very rudimentary writing system, inscriptions on clay tablets. People had no way to take pictures. They understood that Mars went around the sun 42 times every 79 years. That's absolutely remarkable. But we're going to kind of gloss over all that. I guess one other thing worth mentioning is about the year, I don't know, this is maybe the 2nd century BC, there was a Greek gentleman named Aristotle. He's known more as a philosopher today, but Aristotle witnessed the moon passing in front of Mars. He saw the moon eclipsing Mars. Well, that means that Mars has to be further away from us, doesn't it? Now, that sounds obvious to you and I, but if you're just looking at the night sky and there's no such thing as astronomy or astronomy textbooks and you have really no idea what's going on up there, it's not at all obvious. Maybe Mars is closer, but just much, much smaller than the moon. Well, that eclipse of the moon passing in front of Mars was overwhelming evidence that the moon was in fact closer. Now, he had no idea how far away Mars actually was, but he figured out that everything wasn't in the same plane. And that was a big step forward, actually. That there was distance, there was depth to the night sky. There was depth to the universe. But we're going to pick up the story in 1620 when this fella, Galileo Galilei, turned his very first telescope, that might be a lie, turned one of his telescopes to Mars. Now, he had invented the telescope 10 years earlier in 1610. Why it took him 10 years to get to look at Mars, I don't know. But his first recorded observations of Mars happened in the year 1620. And what he saw was pretty remarkable. He couldn't see the moons of Mars, but he could see that deep red color. And so, as with so many other things, Galileo's the first to look at Mars through a telescope. You can see a picture of his telescope here. These things, let me embiggen this for you. Look at these things. That is quite something. You can go out to any department store and spend $60 and get a vastly superior telescope today. But you got to keep in mind that Galileo was building these himself, I believe. He was the first one to do that. So go forward in time about 50 years. Now we're in the latter half of the 17th century. It's the 1660s, I think. And this guy, Giovanni Cassini, Looks like he could be in Def Leppard or something. But Giovanni Cassini was the first human being to try to make maps of surface features. Maps overstating it, sketches of the surface features of Mars, and you can see some of them right here. He decided that he was going to try to figure out how long it took Mars to rotate. He was going to try to find out how long the Martian day was. And so he would witness one of these identifiable features on Mars. After looking at Mars often enough, for long enough, he started to notice patterns. And so he figured out that Mars was rotating. He figured out how often he could see a particular feature at a particular place in Mars. He estimated Mars' day to be 24 hours and 30 minutes. Today, pretty near 400 years later, 350 years later, we think that Mars' day is actually 24 hours and 40 minutes. He was off by 10 minutes. That's really remarkable. No, not much happened for about the next, 1650 to 1750 to 18. It took about 200 years, a little more, before anybody did more than that, until we get to this guy, another Italian. The Italians were all about astronomy, evidently, and Giovanni Schiaparelli made far more detailed maps of Mars because his telescope was much, much better. And if you look at this, you'll notice some of the names that you will even find on globes and maps of Mars today. Here's the Hellas Basin, for example. Here is the Tharsis Plateau with its huge mountains. Here's Chryse and Arabia, Elysium. These are plains that are on maps to this day. But a lot of his names also changed. You'll notice all of these canals. He didn't call them canals, he called them channels. But when the Italian was translated into English, the name got changed to something that sounded more like canals. So, late 1800s, early 1900s, this gentleman with this magnificent mustache named Percival Lowell built an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. He was fantastically wealthy, but he was also a little bit eccentric. He built an observatory, and he did take careful observations of Mars, and he made pictures, but you'll notice in his pictures, he's drawing very straight lines that connect points, right? These almost look like canals between cities. You'll notice how this looks very different than this, but there's nothing like looking to find something that you want to see. Lowell wanted to see evidence for civilizations on Mars, and of course he found it, and he started writing popular articles that convinced the general public that there were, in fact, thriving alien civilizations on Mars. Professional astronomers sort of poo-pooed all of this, but nobody listens to them, even today. And so Lowell had quite a bit of sway over popular opinion of Mars. And Orson Welles had a radio show in which Martians invaded the Earth and people panicked. It's wonderful stuff, yeah? It all came crashing to a halt in the 1960s when the Soviet Union and the United States started sending rovers to other planets. Mariner 4 flew past Mars, I forget the year, it was the 1960s. I apologize, it's in the notes, you can look it up. It was a pretty straightforward spacecraft. It was the first spacecraft the human race, the human species, sent to Mars. And we got back pictures that looked like this. It's a far cry from what you and I are accustomed to seeing, but it was quite something at the time. I believe it was about 5 years later when Mariner 9 spacecraft went into orbit around Mars. Now this was the first spacecraft to orbit any planet at all. Orbiting is really, really nice because you've got a much longer timeline. If you fly past a planet, you've got to remember, if you want to get to a planet in our solar system, you've got to be going 50, 60,000 miles an hour, if not faster, just to get there in any reasonable amount of time, which means when you fly past the planet, you are just screaming, so to speak, which means you don't get a lot of time to take pictures. Going into orbit, you've got all the time in the world. And so we got back pictures that really crushed Lowell's idea of civilizations. We found a very, very cold planet, a desperately dry planet. It was just one big desert, right? Certainly nothing living there, but certainly more detailed pictures. For astronomers and geologists, it was quite something. For the general public, it was a bit of a come down. Over the course of the last 60 years, something like 2 out of every 3 spacecraft sent to Mars have failed. Either the catastrophe struck before they began their mission, or maybe they sent back information briefly. For example, there's a Russian lander that landed on Mars, sent back information for less than a minute before it malfunctioned and stopped working. Mars Curiosity rover has been moving around. It's a rover. It can go wherever people tell it to go, and it's been moving around Mars collecting data for years now. I forget exactly when it landed, but it's been something like it was 2012, so 8 years now. This is a link you can click on to go find information about the rover. It sort of has an iconic picture. One question you might ask yourself is, who took this picture? You can see it's been on there for a day on Mars is called a sol. Lots and lots of images sent back. So you can take some time if you find this kind of thing interesting. We're getting really nice pictures. This is the kind of thing people in the 1960s couldn't even imagine. But really nice pictures. Couple of landers and orbiters I haven't mentioned. The Viking 1 and Viking 2 spacecraft were on Mars or orbiting Mars in the 1970s, and they were very, very successful. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter went into orbit around Mars probably when you guys were just starting school, maybe even before, maybe about the time you were being born, if you're taking this class in 2020. And it has enough fuel to operate through the year 2030, and so it's been sending back the most remarkable pictures. As a result of the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, we have better maps, more accurate, more detailed, more informative maps of Mars than we have of the Earth's ocean floors. Finally, you can't send these rovers and orbiters to Mars any old time. I guess in principle you could. There's nothing from stopping us, but it turns out that there are times when it takes a lot less fuel to go to Mars than other times, and those are called launch windows. And in this picture right here, let me embiggen that for you. Spacecraft launches in Mars distance from Earth, and so Mars gets further away from Earth and then closer, and then further away and closer. These are the oppositions from section 5.3. You'll notice that some of the oppositions are closer, some of the oppositions are further away. But these happen about every 26 months, almost every 2 years. Again, you'll notice 14, 16, right, almost every 2 years. Now this is being measured in gigameters, billions of meters. That works out to millions of miles, right? So these triangles represent the best times to launch, the energetically favorable times, to launch from Earth to Mars. And what's happening, I don't think this is a video. No, it's not a video. But here's Earth. You'll launch your spacecraft, and as it flies further and further away, it's going to get into a wider and wider orbit until finally it's going to intersect Mars, right? Now think about this. You're starting on a planet that's moving around the sun. It's also spinning as it moves around the sun. You're trying to hit a planet tens of millions of miles away that is also spinning as it's also going around the sun at a different speed. And NASA can do that to within a few miles. In fact, these days it might be down to less than a mile. It's almost miraculous. Almost miraculous. Final comment here. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you can look up something called the Hohmann transfer window and get all the details about how this sort of thing works. It doesn't just apply to Mars, it applies to any other planet you want to send a spacecraft to. Final comment, right here, is you'll notice that it's not just NASA that's sending rovers to Mars. There are many other places sending rovers to Mars, and so there's a lot of people getting into the game. Have a great day, guys. We'll see you later.